They thought it was over. A mother's desperate cry, a newborn left drifting in the freezing current of a river. No warmth, no safety, only darkness and silence. And no one would have known until he did. A battle-worn German shepherd who refused an order, and a young cop who chose to trust his partner. What they uncovered would change everything, and what happened next will move you to tears. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe in loyalty, if you believe miracles still happen, hit that subscribe button, because this story will stay with you forever. The town of Bath, Maine was still half asleep when dawn crept across the Kennebec River. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the sagging docks, and the skeletal branches of maples rattled in the brittle January wind. The Sagadahoc Bridge loomed overhead, its steel ribs glinting pale blue in the weak sunlight. It was the sort of morning when the cold bit not just the skin, but the bones. The Kennebec churned below, wide and merciless, the kind of water that had swallowed more than one careless soul in winters past. Officer Mason Reed stood at the edge of the riverbank, his boots crunching over the thin crust of ice that covered the gravel. Mason was 36, with a lean, wiry frame and a face carved by the sort of quiet hardships that never made it into the paperwork. His dark brown hair was always trimmed close, regulation neat, but his storm-gray eyes told a different story, restless, cautious, always scanning. Born and raised in Boston, he had transferred to Bath only 3 months ago, carrying with him the ghost of a failed case that still haunted him, a missing child he hadn't been able to save. Mason carried himself with the restraint of someone who had learned that hope could be fragile. His colleagues often said he spoke less than most, but when he did, people listened. Beside him, tethered loosely to a worn leather lead, stood his partner Atlas, a German shepherd, 9 years old, black and tan coat that shimmered even in the pale light, though age was beginning to gray the fur around his muzzle. He was large, with broad shoulders and a chest that rippled with the strength of years of training. A faint scar marked his right flank, a reminder of a knife fight Mason would never forget, the night when Atlas had leapt between him and a suspect armed with a blade. His amber eyes seemed too knowing, as if they carried centuries of loyalty within them. Atlas wasn't just a K9 unit. He was Mason's anchor. His name had been given years ago by the first handler who trained him, Atlas, because he carries the world on his shoulders. When that handler retired early after an injury, Mason inherited the dog. He had joked at first about renaming him, but the name stuck. It felt right. Mason had come to believe that Atlas did, in his own way, bear the world, their world, every time he ran into danger. The Bath Police Department had been shrinking under budget cuts. There were whispers that Atlas might soon be retired, replaced with a younger dog, cheaper to insure. Mason hated the thought. He knew Atlas still had fire in him, and more importantly, instinct. That morning, it would be instinct that saved a life. Mason had been called to the river because a fisherman reported something odd under the bridge. That fisherman, Caleb Shaw, was now standing a little ways back, hunched in his thick wool coat. Caleb was in his 70s, tall but bent with age, his skin weathered like driftwood. His eyes were pale blue, rheumy but sharp when they narrowed. He had fished these waters since he was a boy, and people said the river ran in his veins. He had the gruff manner of someone who preferred solitude, but his heart was tender. His wife had passed the year before, and he now spent more time on the water than at home, as if the river was the only thing that still listened. "I heard it last night," Caleb muttered, rubbing his chapped hands together. "Truck stopped right there on the bridge. Engine cut out. Sat for maybe 10 minutes, then drove off. Didn't think much of it until I saw that pack dangling in the roots this morning." Mason nodded. His breath steamed as he tightened his coat. His eyes traced the dark shape caught against the roots at the river's edge, a black backpack, waterlogged, twisting faintly with the current. He gave a sharp gesture. "Atlas, fetch." Atlas lowered his head, muscles tense, but instead of springing forward as trained, he froze. His tail went stiff, hackles raised, ears forward. A low growl vibrated deep in his chest. Not fear, not aggression, but something else. "Warning." "Atlas!" Mason repeated, sharper this time. The shepherd shifted, took one step toward the water, then halted again, gaze locked on the pack. His body trembled, not with hesitation, but with defiance. Mason felt a flicker of irritation. In 7 years of working together, Atlas had never disobeyed an order. "Damn dog," Caleb muttered. What's he waiting for? Mason didn't answer. He knew Atlas too well. He crouched down, eye level with the shepherd, searching those amber eyes. "What do you see?" he whispered. The dog's ears twitched, and for a moment, Mason felt as if Atlas was trying to speak without words. Then, without warning, Atlas surged forward like a released arrow. He hit the water with a muted splash, muscles cutting through the icy current. Mason's pulse spiked. He knew how dangerous the Kennebec was in January near freezing, capable of dragging even a strong man under. Yet Atlas swam with purpose, not straight toward the bag but angling slightly downstream, letting the current carry him close. Atlas reached the backpack, circled once, then gently clamped his jaws around one strap. He did not shake it or tug roughly, as he might with contraband or evidence. Instead, he gripped it with the kind of care Mason had only seen when Atlas carried training dummies meant to simulate infants. Slowly, powerfully, he began dragging the heavy pack back to shore. Mason splashed into the shallows to meet him, icy water biting at his boots. The pack was heavier than expected when he hauled it up. Water poured out in streams, and the zipper, partially broken, hung open just enough for Mason to see inside. A tiny fist, pale, trembling. A cry so weak it was almost drowned by the wind. Mason staggered back, his breath caught. "It's a baby," he whispered hoarsely. Caleb's eyes widened, the old fisherman crossing himself in shock. The infant was no more than a few days old, swaddled in a soaked hospital blanket. Mason ripped off his gloves, pressing the baby against his chest for warmth, his heart hammering. The cries grew a little louder, fragile but alive. Alive. Caleb's voice cracked. "Lord Almighty, someone left her there." Mason shouted into his radio, calling for an ambulance, his voice breaking the stillness of the frosted morning. Atlas stood dripping on the shore, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the bundle in Mason's arms. His ears were pricked, body trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper, an intensity that said he knew exactly what he had saved. When the paramedics arrived minutes later, the infant was whisked away, but not before Mason noticed a slim hospital ID band still clinging to her tiny wrist. The letters had blurred, but one word remained legible. Hope. The name stuck. By the time the ambulance doors closed, the story was already spreading. How Atlas, the old dog everyone thought ready for retirement, had refused an order and saved a life. To the people of Bath, she would be known simply as Baby Hope. Mason knelt, resting a hand on Atlas's damp fur. The shepherd blinked slowly, then nudged his nose against Mason's palm. "You carried the world today, buddy," Mason murmured. And for the first time in months, since that failed case in Boston, Mason felt the weight on his shoulders lift just a little. The Bath police station was a squat brick building near the waterfront, its windows fogged by the clash of warm radiators inside and the icy wind outside. Officer Mason Reed sat in the narrow room used for evidence review, his jacket still damp from the river, his boots leaving a trail of thawing ice on the floor. The room smelled faintly of coffee, bleach, and old paperwork. Atlas lay at his feet, stretched out but alert, head resting on his paws as if he were listening to every whisper of the place. On the monitor before Mason, the security footage from the Sagadahoc Bridge flickered grainy but clear enough. He adjusted the playback to the hours before dawn. The river had looked the same as when he stood there this morning, endless black water, the faint shimmer of ice floes drifting like broken glass. Then the image caught something, headlights flaring out of the fog. A late-model pickup truck pulled to a stop at the exact place where the backpack had later been found. The vehicle sat there for almost 10 minutes, engine lights glowing faintly, before pulling away. Mason felt his jaw tighten. 28 minutes before the 911 call had come through. 28 minutes that decided whether a newborn lived or froze. He leaned closer to the screen, pausing the frame to note the shape of the cab, the particular angle of the headlights. Atlas's ears twitched as Mason exhaled through his nose. Whoever had left that child hadn't simply abandoned her out of panic. Something more deliberate was happening. Mason scribbled notes and slid them into the case file, then pushed himself up, stretching his stiff shoulders. He could still feel the cold of the river in his bones. He thought briefly about going home to shower and change, but the case wouldn't wait. Instead, he poured himself another cup of coffee from the communal pot in the break room, dark liquid that tasted burnt but kept him upright. On his way back, a voice stopped him. "You look like hell, Reed." The words belonged to Nora Quinn, a reporter for the local paper, the Kennebec Gazette. Nora was 31, with auburn hair pulled back into a loose bun and glasses perched on her nose. She was dressed in a navy peacoat that looked a size too big, sleeves rolled, with a notebook sticking out of one pocket. Nora had a reputation in Bath. Persistent, sharp-tongued, sometimes reckless in her pursuit of stories, but respected because she dug where others didn't. Her father had once been a lobsterman who disappeared at sea, and people whispered that this was why she chased the truth so fiercely, because she knew how it felt to be left with silence instead of answers. "I appreciate the compliment," Mason replied dryly, sipping his coffee. Nora's eyes narrowed. "I heard about the baby. Atlas pulled her from the river, right? Don't you dare brush me off, Reed. This isn't just some sad domestic case. People don't drive out in the middle of the night and toss newborns into rivers for no reason." Mason didn't want to encourage her, but her words echoed the suspicion gnawing at him. "It's early," he said evenly. "We don't have facts yet." "Yeah, but you have instincts," Nora shot back, glancing at Atlas, who raised his head. "And so does he." Mason didn't answer. He had no intention of feeding a reporter, but he didn't dismiss her either. Nora's persistence often rubbed officers raw, but more than once her leads had pointed to truths they had missed. By noon, a new lead arrived from the detectives who had checked with local businesses. A credit card tied to a missing young woman had pinged at a roadside gas station 30 minutes south of Bath. Mason grabbed his coat, clipped Atlas's lead, and drove through snow-dusted highways until the neon sign of the gas station appeared in the distance. Inside, the gas station smelled of gasoline, fried food, and damp newspapers. The clerk, a heavy-set man in his 40s named Dale Pritchard, leaned on the counter, his thinning hair sticking up from a wool cap. He had tired eyes, but carried himself with the calm indifference of someone who had worked long, uneventful shifts. Mason showed his badge, asked about the credit card use. Dale's eyes flickered with memory. "She came in early, maybe 5:30, he said, scratching his chin. "Young, 20-something, pale face, blonde hair messy, wearing a winter coat that looked too thin for the weather. She bought baby formula, a pack of nuts, barely said a word. But her lip," he pointed at his own, "split, like someone hit her. And she kept glancing at the door like a rabbit waiting for the fox." Mason's stomach sank. He asked carefully, "Was she alone?" Dale shook his head slowly. "Came in alone. But there was a truck parked outside, newer model, dark paint. Driver didn't come in, crew cut. Just sat there, watching. I thought maybe it was her ride, boyfriend, whatever. But the way she kept staring over her shoulder didn't look right." Mason jotted down every detail. The driver's crew cut, the truck. Dale hesitated, then added, "Name on the card said Lena Rourke." That's what showed on the receipt. The name hit Mason like a stone. He recognized it from a missing persons bulletin circulated a week earlier. A 22-year-old woman from Augusta reported missing after leaving the hospital against medical advice with her newborn. Her family had said she was overwhelmed but determined to care for her child. Now the pieces were snapping into place. Back outside, the winter sun had climbed weakly overhead, giving no warmth. Mason opened the patrol car door and Atlas jumped in, shaking snow from his coat. Mason leaned on the steering wheel, staring at the gas station. Someone had forced Lena into a desperate corner. She had not abandoned her child by choice. Before he could start the engine, Atlas shifted, his nose pushing against the paper bag Mason had left on the passenger seat. Mason frowned, pulled it away. "Don't even think about it." But the shepherd was faster. With a deft movement, Atlas swiped a donut from the bag and munched loudly, crumbs scattering across the seat. Mason sighed, half annoyed, half amused. "You save one baby and suddenly you get a free pass on pastry theft?" Atlas thumped his tail against the seat, utterly unapologetic. The sound made Mason's lips twitch, a fleeting moment of levity against the heavy tide of the day. The lightness vanished when he returned to the station. Nora was waiting outside, tapping her pen against her notebook. "Word is you've got a name now," she said, sharp eyes cutting through him. "Lena Rourke. That doesn't sound like a monster to me. It sounds like someone running from one Mason's gaze darkened." "You get that from your sources, or are you just guessing?" Nora smiled tightly. "Call it intuition, and I think this is bigger than one scared girl." Mason didn't confirm or deny. Instead, he let Atlas out of the car. The shepherd stretched, shook his coat, and stared across the street, his ears pricked, body tense. Mason followed his gaze, scanning the road. For a brief second, the reflection of a truck's windshield caught the sunlight far down the block before disappearing behind traffic. Mason's gut clenched. He had the name of the girl, the hint of her abuser, and the shape of something bigger forming in the shadows. And all the while, Atlas's instincts hummed beside him, sharper than any words. Snow turned to freezing rain as Mason steered the patrol car off Route 1 and into the narrow service road that cut through Bath's salt marshes. The road was more a memory than pavement, riddled with potholes and edged by tall reeds heavy with ice. Gray light bled across the horizon, and the air smelled of brine and rot, a mix of the river's breath and the decay of winter. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, ears pricked forward, body taut with anticipation. His fur was still damp from their earlier search, and the faint scent of river water clung to him. Mason's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he followed the tire tracks ahead, fresh, narrow treads weaving deeper into the marsh. When the road ended, Mason killed the engine. Silence pressed down, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Atlas leapt out, nose immediately pressed to the ground, tail stiff. Mason followed, boots sinking into half-frozen mud. The tracks led them into reeds that rose higher than Mason's shoulders, whispering with every gust. The reeds opened suddenly onto a clearing where a faded blue tarp flapped weakly over a makeshift shelter of driftwood and rusted metal poles. Inside, a figure crouched. She startled when Mason called softly, flashlight beam falling across her face. Lena Rourke was barely 22 but looked older, her cheeks hollowed by exhaustion, her blonde hair matted under a hood. Her winter coat hung open, soaked through, and her hands clutched the edges of a blanket that wasn't there anymore. Her wide eyes darted between Mason and Atlas, terror etched deep. Mason crouched low, his voice calm. "Lena, I'm Officer Reed. You're safe now." Her lips trembled, words breaking like brittle glass. "He'll find me. He always does." Atlas stepped forward slowly, his amber eyes fixed on her, body low but steady. Lena flinched, then froze as the dog sat, silent and patient as if waiting for her to decide. Tears spilled down her face. Mason inched closer. "Who, Lena? Who's after you?" Her voice cracked, raw. Travis Crowley. He said if he couldn't control me, he'd control her. He said the baby wasn't his, that I trapped him. He hit me when I said I'd keep her. When the hospital released me, I knew he was waiting. I had to run." Her hands clenched, nails digging into her palms. The river was the only chance. "I left the bracelet in the bag so someone would know she mattered." Mason's chest tightened. He had seen women like Lena before, young, cornered, carrying both the weight of survival and the shame of never being believed. He gestured for Atlas, who eased closer, nudging Lena's arm with a wet nose. She let out a sob, burying her face into the shepherd's thick fur, as if she hadn't been touched with kindness in years. While Mason reassured her, back in Bath, another thread was unfolding. Marisol Vega, a social worker in her early 40s, was now at the hospital with baby Hope. Marisol was of Puerto Rican heritage, with dark curly hair streaked with silver, glasses perched low on her nose, and a wardrobe of practical sweaters that smelled faintly of lavender. She had chosen child welfare after nearly losing her younger brother to foster care when she was a teenager. Colleagues described her as gentle but immovable, like a river current compassionate with children, relentless with bureaucracy. In the NICU, she hovered protectively near Hope's incubator, adjusting the baby's blanket with practiced tenderness. Meanwhile, Nora Quinn refused to let the trail grow cold. In her cramped office above the Gazette, paper stacks towered like precarious walls around her desk. She sifted through county records, eyes sharp behind smudged glasses. One name recurred: Eldon Crowley, Travis's uncle, listed as the owner of an abandoned boathouse near Portland Harbor. Eldon was in his 60s, a man whose reputation carried the sour smell of bad debts and darker rumors. Neighbors remembered him as tall, broad-shouldered, with a hawk's beak nose and a gaze that made people uneasy. He had once run a small freight business before going bankrupt. Since then, whispers followed him, about missing shipments, about things moved in the dead of night. Nora scribbled furiously in her notebook. This wasn't just about Lena and her baby. Something bigger was moving under the surface, and Eldon Crowley's name sat like an oil slick on the water. That same evening, Mason brought Lena to the station for warmth and protection. She huddled under a gray blanket, hands shaking around a paper cup of tea. Atlas never strayed far, lying at her feet as though keeping watch. Mason knew the girl's terror wasn't imagined. He filed his preliminary report but couldn't shake the weight of her words. If he couldn't control me, he'd control her. Later, Mason took Atlas for a final sweep of the docks. The night air was sharp, fog curling low over the harbor. The old boathouse loomed ahead, boards warped, windows black. Atlas stiffened, nose working furiously. Mason clicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting across the damp floorboards. There, dark smears of oil, fresh against the grain. Not the dust of abandonment, but the mark of recent use. Someone had been here. Atlas barked once, sharp and low, tail rigid. Mason crouched, fingers brushing the slick patch, his stomach tightening. This wasn't just a frightened girl's story anymore. Something tied Lena's abuser to places and people Mason had no business ignoring. He looked at Atlas, who stared back with steady amber eyes. The dog's growl rolled like distant thunder. The marsh, the girl, the boathouse. They were all threads of a net being pulled tight. And Mason knew they had only brushed its edge. The boathouse crouched on the edge of Portland Harbor like a hulking skeleton, its roof sagging under decades of salt air, the wooden boards slick with mildew. Fog rolled in thick from the water, swallowing sound and blurring the horizon into a wall of shifting gray. Mason Reed moved cautiously across the uneven dock, flashlight in one hand, his other resting near the holster at his hip. Beside him padded Atlas, the shepherd's nose twitching, body tense, every sense alert. The dog's low growl vibrated through the quiet, more felt than heard. The creak of a hinge broke the silence. From the shadows within the boathouse, a figure emerged, Travis Crowley. 26, broad-shouldered but with the wiry, restless energy of someone always ready for a fight. His dark hair was cropped close, his jaw unshaven, eyes darting with paranoid sharpness. He wore a heavy Carhartt jacket stained with oil, his jeans stiff with grime, and boots that tracked wet mud. The smirk on his face was thin, cold, the kind that dared the world to challenge him. "So the cop finally found his way here," Travis sneered, pulling a handgun from his jacket. His knuckles were white on the grip, his finger hovering close to the trigger. "You should have stayed in Bath, Reed." "This is family business." Mason kept his voice steady. "Put it down, Travis. It doesn't have to end like this." Travis's eyes flicked to Atlas, standing low and ready, amber eyes burning. "That mutt doesn't scare me," he spat. But his stance betrayed him, the way his weight shifted, the way his shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. Before Mason could take another step, Travis jerked the gun up. In the same heartbeat, Atlas launched forward. He hit Travis like a thunderbolt, teeth snapping onto the pistol's magazine, wrenching it free with terrifying precision. The magazine clattered to the floor, bullets scattering across the damp wood. Travis cursed, swinging the weapon wildly, but without ammunition it was little more than an empty threat. Mason moved, closing the gap, grabbing Travis's wrist and slamming it against a support beam until the gun fell. In seconds, Travis was on the ground, face pressed to the boards, Mason's cuffs snapping shut around his wrists. Atlas stood over him, teeth bared inches from his neck, chest heaving, growl low and steady. Mason gave a sharp command and the dog stepped back, though his gaze never left Travis. Mason searched Travis, pulling a smartphone from his jacket pocket. He scrolled through quickly, his stomach tightening as images filled the screen photos of shipping containers, numbered warehouses, and a calendar of midnight ferry schedules. This wasn't a single man's cruelty, it was a network. Meanwhile, Nora Quinn had followed her own thread. Back at her apartment above a laundromat, she'd received a call from a blocked number. The voice was distorted, but the message was clear. "Find Warehouse 12 near the Portland docks. That's where they move them." The line went dead before she could respond. Nora sat at her cluttered desk, scribbling the note in her messy handwriting, her pulse racing. She wasn't sure if she'd been handed a lifeline or a death sentence, but instincts told her this was bigger than she'd imagined. Back at the boathouse, Mason radioed his captain. Inside the Portland PD headquarters, Captain Elaine Mercer answered. Elaine was in her mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with short silver hair and a no-nonsense gaze that could cut through excuses like glass. A career officer, she had risen through the ranks not by charm, but by an unshakable sense of discipline. She spoke in clipped sentences, her patience tested by years of budget cuts and overwork. Still, she had a reputation for protecting her people fiercely when things turned dangerous. "Mason," her voice crackled over the radio, "you better tell me you've got more than a single suspect in cuffs." "I've got his phone," Mason said, flipping through more messages-coded notes, ferry manifests, addresses marked only by initials. "This isn't just Travis. It's organized. It fits the Boston pattern from 3 years ago. He hadn't meant to say it, but the words slipped out, bitter as bile. The case that had driven him out of Boston, the missing child who was never found, the trail that led nowhere, this phone mirrored that nightmare. The same ferry docks, the same warehouse codes. A knot formed in his chest. Silence stretched, then Mercer's voice returned, sharper now. Then we don't sit on this. Send me everything. We coordinate with the state task force. Mason nodded grimly, pocketing the phone. Atlas shifted, ears flicking at the distant sound of a ferry horn. It echoed through the fog, long and mournful, but Atlas reacted as if it were something more. The shepherd barked once, sharp and insistent, then let out a whine circling the dock. Mason frowned. The dog had never reacted to ferry horns before. Was it a signal? A code in plain sight? Travis laughed bitterly from the ground, blood on his lip where Mason had pinned him. You think you're saving anyone? You don't know what you've stepped into. My uncle owns this harbor. You can cut one rope, but the net still tightens. Mason hauled him upright, cuffs biting into his wrists. Your uncle's name is Eldon Crowley. And he just made my list. As backup units arrived to take Travis into custody, Mason let his gaze sweep the dark water. Somewhere out there, under the fog, ships moved silently, carrying cargo that should never have existed. He rested a hand on Atlas's neck, feeling the steady thrum of muscle beneath fur. The shepherd's amber eyes locked onto the water as if he could already smell what was coming. For Mason, the boathouse wasn't an ending. It was the door he had feared since Boston, a door now cracked wide open. The drive into rural New Hampshire was long and cloaked in the kind of silence only backroads could conjure. Snowbanks lined the narrow lanes, and the skeletal silhouettes of bare trees clutched at the gray sky. Mason Reed gripped the steering wheel, eyes flicking between the road and the old postcard resting on the dashboard. The image was faded, edges curled with time, but the outline of a crooked windmill stood clear against a lonely field. On the back, scribbled in a hand that was neither careful nor entirely steady, were the words, "She stays where the blades no longer turn." Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, his body still despite the rocking of the vehicle. His amber eyes tracked the landscape, nose twitching at every unfamiliar scent that drifted through the cracked window. When Mason slowed near a derelict farm, the dog gave a low whine. There it was, the windmill, half collapsed, its blades rusted and unmoving. The farmhouse sagged as though its foundations had surrendered years ago. Boards were missing from the walls, and the paint had peeled into flakes that littered the ground like old parchment. A light breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of rust and the sharper scent of fear-something Atlas seemed to catch instantly. His ears perked, hackles bristling as Mason parked and stepped out into the crunch of ice. Inside the house, the air was damp and stale. Mason's flashlight beam swept across shattered furniture and water-stained wallpaper. Atlas moved ahead, nose close to the floorboards, tail stiff, guiding Mason through the ruin. They found the trapdoor hidden beneath a rotting rug, the hinges rusted but not untouched. Mason pried it open, the wood groaning. A staircase descended into darkness. From below came the faintest sound, a stifled sob. Mason's throat tightened. He gestured to Atlas, who descended carefully, paws barely making a sound. The beam of light revealed a small, dirt-floored cellar. In one corner, a child crouched, June Avery, 6 years old. She was painfully thin, knees drawn to her chest, dark hair tangled across her pale face. Her wide blue eyes stared at the intruders, too hollow for her age. She wore a cotton dress that might have once been pink, now soiled and torn, her bare feet blotched with cold. Standing over her was an elderly woman, knife clutched tight in gnarled hands. Her body was stooped, gray hair hanging in wisps, her skin drawn tight across sharp cheekbones. Her clothes were mismatched layers of sweaters and skirts that looked scavenged, stained with food and dirt. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, lips moving with fragments of words Mason couldn't understand. She swayed as though caught between reality and some other time. "Ma'am," Mason said softly, one hand raised, his voice even. "I don't want anyone to get hurt." The woman hissed, tightening her grip on the knife. June whimpered, curling tighter into herself. Atlas stepped forward in a slow arc, body low, ears angled back to appear less threatening. His paws pressed silently into the dirt as he circled, his gaze fixed on the blade. He let out a low woof, neither bark nor growl, just sound, steady and grounding. The woman's glassy eyes flicked toward him, confused by his calmness. In that heartbeat of distraction, Mason moved. He closed the distance, grabbed her wrist, and twisted gently but firmly until the knife clattered to the floor. She collapsed into a sobbing heap, words spilling out about voices in the windmill and the child's silence. June hadn't moved. She trembled in her corner, lips pressed tight. Atlas shifted, lowering himself to the dirt until his chest touched the ground. He inched forward, stopping just short of the girl. His tail gave the faintest wag, a tentative rhythm of reassurance. Slowly, June lifted her gaze. Her small hand reached out, trembling, until it brushed his fur. A single word escaped her lips, soft but clear. Dog. It was the first word she had spoken in days, maybe weeks. Mason felt his chest ache as Atlas pressed closer, letting her bury her face in his thick coat. Back in Bath, the next steps were already being taken. Dr. Lillian Hart, a child psychologist in her late 40s, was preparing her therapy room. She was tall and willowy, with short black hair streaked silver and kind hazel eyes that crinkled when she smiled. Known for her pioneering work in early intervention therapy, she was respected for her blend of clinical skill and warmth. Having grown up with a stutter that left her isolated as a child, she carried deep empathy for those who struggled to speak. Lillian set out blankets and toys, but at the center of the room was what she called her bridge sessions that incorporated K9S to help children form safe connections. She was ready for June. Elsewhere, Marisol Vega supervised an emotional reunion. At the hospital, Lena sat nervously in a small room, her hands twisting in her lap. When Marisol carried in baby Hope, Lena's breath broke into a sob. Under strict observation, Lena cradled her daughter, whispering apologies, tears streaming down her face. Hope squirmed, whimpering, before settling against her chest. Marisol remained close, clipboard in hand, but her expression softened. She had seen countless supervised visits, but rarely one that felt this raw, this desperate. Later, Mason teased Atlas during their patrol walk near the docks. A flock of seagulls circled overhead, squawking noisily. Atlas stopped dead, ears pinned, eyes narrowed at the birds as though they were his mortal enemies. Mason laughed under his breath. "Even heroes have nemeses," he muttered. "And yours happen to be seagulls." The shepherd snorted, unimpressed, before trotting on. Yet the weight of the windmill cellar lingered with Mason. He knew June's whispered word wasn't just recognition of a dog. It was the beginning of her return to the world, one paw print at a time. The investigation room smelled of stale coffee and pencil shavings, its corkboards crowded with notes and maps pinned in overlapping layers. Mason Reed leaned over the biggest board, tracing red string with his finger. Nora Quinn stood beside him, hair tied back in a loose knot, glasses slipping down her nose as she scribbled in her ever-present notebook. Atlas dozed nearby, but not fully. One ear flicked at every small sound, his body coiled like a spring ready to leap. Nora pointed to a cluster of pins. "Look, each reported disappearance along the coastlines up with the ferry schedules you pulled from Travis's phone. Boston 3 years ago, Providence, New Haven, then here in Bath. And always within a night of a ferry departure, her voice quickened, urgent. It's a system, Mason." They moved them like cargo. Mason's jaw tightened. The pins were too many, too precise. His gray eyes lingered on one note scrawled in the corner. Boston, 2019. That was his failure, the case that had ended with a shuttered warehouse, a lock he hadn't cut quickly enough, and a child who had never been found. He felt the old guilt rising, sharp as bile. Atlas shifted and let out a soft bark, snapping Mason from his spiral. Mason crouched, scratching the dog behind his ears. "I won't miss the door this time," he muttered. Atlas blinked, as if he understood. While Mason wrestled with maps and ghosts, June Avery sat in the hospital art room. Crayons littered the table as she drew with small, tentative strokes. She sketched Atlas' big body, soft eyes, and atop his head, a golden crown. Marisol Vega sat with her, smiling gently, guiding her hand when she faltered. "He's your king, huh?" Marisol teased softly. June only nodded, her lips curving faintly upward. Nora, visiting for her story, noticed the drawing and later scanned it for her paper's fundraising campaign. "The king dog who saved me." Donations poured in, but more importantly, June began to believe in her own voice again. The break in the case came from a tip. A weathered postcard was slid under the Gazette's office door late at night. On it was a child's scrawl. Ashley Godwin, green eyes, 6 years old. The chapel holds her. On the back, a faded map of Portland Harbor, a circle around a rusted chapel near the rail line. Nora rushed to Mason with it, and though skeptical of anonymous tips, Mason saw no choice. The chapel stood at the edge of the city, forgotten. Its steeple leaned like a drunk, its bell long stolen, windows sealed with rusted iron. Salt stains streaked its white paint, mapping the years of ocean storms. Atlas whined softly as they approached, nose working furiously. Mason ran his hand over the padlock on the cellar door, rusted but recently disturbed. He felt the cold iron, his pulse quickening. "Atlas?" Mason whispered. The shepherd stepped back, squared himself, then let out a single, sharp bark. Mason had learned by now, one bark meant here, exactly here. They pried the door open, wood splintering. The smell hit them first, damp stone, mold, and the faint woolly scent of fabric long worn by children. Flashlight beams swept across the cellar, old cots, ragged blankets, and in the far corner, a girl huddled. Ashley Godwin, 6 years old, pale as paper, eyes wide and green like sea glass. She clutched a tattered stuffed bear, its seams bursting, its fur stiff with dirt. She flinched at the light, but when Atlas lowered himself, tail sweeping slowly, she hesitated. Then, like June before her, she inched forward, small fingers gripping the dog's fur. Her whisper was almost lost in the echoes. "Don't leave." Mason's chest tightened as he lifted her gently. "You're safe now," he murmured. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. On a table against the wall, they found a spiral notebook. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, verses, sermons twisted into warnings, lists of names. At the bottom of one page, underlined 3 times, was the name Raymond Pike. Back at the station, Mason flipped through the notebook, bile rising. Pike was a disgraced minister from Vermont, expelled after accusations of manipulation and child endangerment that had never stuck in court. He was tall, bald, with a preacher's booming voice, but his reputation was shadows and whispers. Now his name was inked inside the chapel, tied to the missing. Atlas slept by Mason's desk, chest rising steadily, but twitched when the distant ferry horn echoed through the harbor. Mason's eyes lifted. The sound used to mean commerce, life on the coast. Now it was something else, a signal. The docks at Portland Harbor were cloaked in fog and shadows, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and brine. The ferry terminal, usually alive with chatter and seagulls, had gone quiet for the night. Only the low hum of idling engines and the rhythmic clang of steel against water broke the silence. Mason Reed crouched behind a stack of shipping crates, his breath clouding in the cold. Atlas crouched low beside him, the German shepherd's fur bristling, amber eyes fixed on the loading ramp ahead. The dog's body was taut, every muscle coiled with anticipation. Across the lot, headlights cut through the mist as a white cargo van reversed slowly toward the ferry's loading ramp. A second vehicle, a battered pickup, idled nearby. From the passenger side emerged Raymond Pike, the disgraced minister Mason had only known through files and whispered rumors until now. In person, Pike was tall and broad-chested, his bald scalp gleaming under the dock lights. He wore a long black coat that billowed slightly in the wind, and even from a distance Mason could see the way he moved, deliberate, with the bearing of a man who believed he was still leading a congregation. His lips moved constantly, as though reciting scripture to himself. Near him, barking orders to 2 younger men unloading heavy crates, was Eldon Crowley. The uncle of Travis, Eldon was in his early 60s, tall and thick in the shoulders, his hawkish nose and close-set eyes giving him the look of a predator. His salt and pepper hair stuck out from beneath a wool cap, and a heavy gold ring glinted on his hand each time he gestured. Eldon's reputation for shady deals had followed him for years, but seeing him here, orchestrating cargo at midnight, confirmed everything Nora had warned. Mason's radio crackled softly in his earpiece. Detective Jonah Briggs, the leader of the task force unit, whispered from another position. Briggs was in his late 40s, short and stocky, with dark hair peppered gray at the temples. His face carried the lines of long nights and tougher cases, but his eyes were sharp and steady. Known for his patience and a dry sense of humor, Briggs was the kind of man who only spoke when it mattered. "We wait until they start loading. No mistakes. Copy?" Mason gave a brief nod, though only Atlas saw it. The shepherd's ears twitched, his tail flicking once against the dock. The first crate hit the van floor with a metallic thud. Mason's hand hovered near his holster. Pike stood by the ramp, watching like a priest at the altar, while Eldon barked for the men to hurry. Then Mason saw it, the van's back doors ajar, just enough for his flashlight to catch a glimpse of stacked folders, loose papers, and a row of envelopes. He zoomed his camera phone in and captured the image: false passports, transit manifests, and lists of names. A transfer list. Mason's stomach turned cold. It was confirmation of a trafficking network that spanned far beyond Maine. Atlas gave a sudden low growl. Mason glanced at him sharply, but the dog's eyes were locked on the van's wheels. The vehicle lurched backward, brake lights glowing as it neared the ramp. Mason realized too late the van was going to be on the ferry within minutes, cargo and all. Briggs's voice hissed, "Not yet." Wait for the signal. But Atlas didn't wait. With a burst of motion, the shepherd sprinted from cover, a streak of black and tan against the mist. He leapt in front of the van, jaws clamping onto the dangling brake line beneath. The van jerked violently, rolling to a halt as the parking brake cable snapped loose. The driver slammed the wheel, swearing, but the vehicle wouldn't move. Shouts erupted. Pike spun, his booming voice cutting through the chaos, while Eldon cursed, waving his arms. "Go, go, go!" Briggs roared through the radio. From every shadow of the dock, task force officers surged forward, weapons drawn. The younger men dropped their crates and bolted, only to be tackled before they could vanish into the mist. Pike tried to raise his arms as though in benediction, words spilling from his lips, but Mason was already on him, slamming him against the van and cuffing him hard. Eldon Crowley swung at one officer before Briggs himself tackled the older man to the ground, his face pressed into the wet pavement. The van's back doors were yanked wide. Inside were binders stuffed with false identities, dozens of passports from multiple countries, and at least 2 ledgers listing departures and arrivals. Each line carried names, initials, dates, and destinations. It was the entire skeleton of their operation, laid bare in ink. Atlas stood proudly in the chaos, tail high, ears forward. His chest heaved, but his eyes were steady, fixed on Mason. Mason knelt beside him, gripping his collar firmly. "Good boy," he murmured, voice rough with emotion. The aftermath stretched into hours. Officers combed the dock, evidence piled onto tables, and suspects were loaded into transport vehicles. Pike sat in the back of a cruiser, face slack, muttering half-prayers. Eldon glared like a cornered wolf, lips sealed. By dawn, word had spread. The town rallied. A coalition of volunteers and donors created a fund, Harbor Lights, to help reunite rescued children with families and to support those who had no one left. At its first meeting, stories of resilience spilled out. June's drawing of Atlas with a crown was displayed at the center, the symbol of a new campaign. Mason's younger sister, Tess Reed, arrived from Boston to volunteer. Tess was 32, petite, with auburn hair cut short, freckles dusting her face, and a ready smile that masked years of distance between her and Mason. They had drifted apart after their parents' death, Tess throwing herself into community work while Mason buried himself in the badge. But as she handed out blankets to children and greeted survivors, she glanced at Mason with a small, tentative smile. The gap between them began to close. Later, Nora Quinn finished her article. The headline blazed across the Gazette the next morning. "When a dog says no." Her words carried both fury and hope, chronicling how an aging German shepherd had refused an order, saved a baby, and unraveled a network that had hidden in plain sight. Donations to Harbor Lights soared. Letters flooded in from as far as Seattle and London, praising the courage of Mason and his dog. That night, back at the station, Mason sat in the quiet with Atlas curled at his feet. He thought of Pike's eyes, Eldon's defiance, and the lists they had uncovered. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Mason felt the tide shift in favor of the innocent. Atlas stirred, lifting his head, ears catching the distant ferry horn echoing across the bay. This time, it was not a signal of fear, but of victory. The courthouse in Portland smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, its high ceilings echoing with the footsteps of lawyers and families hurrying through the marble hallways. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, pale but steady, a reminder that winter was loosening its grip. Mason Reed sat on a bench near the back of the courtroom, Atlas at his feet. The shepherd's ears perked as though he understood the gravity of the moment. The German shepherd's black and tan coat gleamed under the light, the faint gray around his muzzle giving him a noble, weathered look. At the front, Judge Marion Cole presided. She was in her early 60s, tall with sharp cheekbones softened by kind blue eyes. Her silver hair was tied in a low bun, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades balancing law and compassion. Known for her meticulous attention to detail and her fierce stance against organized crime, Judge Cole was not one to tolerate theatrics in her courtroom. When the verdict was read, the silence broke. Raymond Pike and Eldon Crowley were sentenced to lengthy prison terms on charges of human trafficking, conspiracy, and endangerment of minors. Pike's eyes darted wildly, muttering broken scripture as bailiffs led him away. Eldon sneered, but his hands trembled in their cuffs. For the first time in years, their empire had collapsed in plain sight. The court then turned to protective custody petitions. Lena Rourke sat at the plaintiff's table, her blonde hair brushed for the first time in weeks, though her face was still pale from sleepless nights. Beside her sat public defender Clara Jennings, a woman in her late 30s, short-haired, glasses perched at the tip of her nose, her expression sharp but steady. Clara was known for her tenacity in advocating for women caught in cycles of abuse. She rested a hand lightly on Lena's arm as Judge Cole granted her entry into the Witness Protection Program. Lena broke down, tears streaking her cheeks as she held baby Hope in her arms. The infant yawned, tiny fingers curling around Lena's sweater. In another corner of the courtroom, 6-year-old June Avery sat with her new guardian, her aunt, Rebecca Avery, a woman in her 40s with auburn hair streaked with gray. Rebecca was tall, her frame softened by years of farm work and motherhood. She had raised 3 sons and thought her days of child-rearing were behind her, until June's rescue had changed everything. When the judge confirmed the reunification, June clutched Rebecca's hand, eyes brighter than Mason had ever seen them. Ashley Godwin's reunion was more raucous. Her parents, David and Michelle, rushed forward the moment the gavel struck, scooping their daughter into their arms. David, a broad-shouldered man with rough carpenter's hands, lifted Ashley high, tears streaming freely. Michelle, petite with kind brown eyes, held both tightly, her sobs mingling with laughter. The bear Ashley had carried in the cellar was clutched between them, a relic of her survival. The day's proceedings were not just about justice, but healing. Outside, reporters gathered, microphones shoved forward. Nora Quinn stood among them, notebook in hand. When it was her turn to ask a question, she didn't aim it at the officials but at Mason, who stood with Atlas at his side. "What made the difference here, Officer Reed?" she asked, her voice clear enough for every camera. Mason glanced down at Atlas, who blinked back with calm certainty. "Sometimes the difference," Mason said softly, "is knowing when to say no." The phrase echoed, carried in headlines the next morning. Weeks later, the community of Bath gathered along the Kennebec River for the first Harbor Lights Festival, organized by the coalition that had grown from the rescue. Hundreds of lanterns, each carrying handwritten prayers or names of loved ones, were released into the night sky, drifting over the dark water like stars finding their way home. The docks glowed with families, survivors, and neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder. Tess Reed, Mason's sister, handed out candles with her easy smile, chatting with townsfolk as if she'd lived there her whole life. The rift between her and Mason had softened into something warmer, unspoken but sure. Nora Quinn was called onto the stage, where she accepted the Maine State Journalism Award for her series When a Dog Says No. She looked both proud and slightly overwhelmed, brushing hair from her face as the crowd applauded. For once she seemed shy, but her eyes sought Mason in the crowd, and she raised the plaque as though sharing it with him and Atlas. In Dr. Lillian Hart's therapy room, laughter rang out weeks later. June Avery lay on the rug, coloring with broad, messy strokes, while Atlas rested his massive head across her legs. When she giggled at the dog's snoring, Lillian smiled and scribbled in her notes. Progress milestone. June laughing spontaneously during session. For a girl once silent as stone, the sound was a miracle. Not far away, Lena Rourke sat in a quiet apartment packing a small box. She folded the hospital bracelet, the one she had left in the backpack, into the box alongside a photo of her and Hope taken just days earlier. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Thank you, Atlas." Then she closed the lid and tucked it into the back of a drawer, not to forget, but to remember how close she had come to losing everything. Atlas himself had not retired. At the police station, Captain Mercer presented him with a medal, the crowd clapping as the shepherd wagged his tail and leaned against Mason's leg. Yet Mason refused when asked if it was time to let him rest. "He's not done," Mason said simply. "By day, he's a cop. By night, he's family." The officers laughed, but no one argued. That night at the festival, Mason stood at the river's edge, lanterns floating overhead. Atlas pressed close, his fur warm against the chill. Mason ran a hand along the dog's back, whispering words meant for only the two of them. Sometimes saving lives starts with a single no. Atlas thumped his tail against the dock, eyes fixed on the lights ascending. And for Mason, it felt for the first time in years that hope had a home. In the end, this story is not just about a police officer or a dog. It is about the quiet miracles that still move among us, the way God often works through the least expected messengers. A German shepherd who refused an order, a child who found her voice with one word, a mother who held her baby again, all reminders that even in the darkest night, light can break through. And maybe that is what we need to carry into our daily lives. Miracles are not only grand and distant, they live in the choices we make to protect, to trust, to love. God places opportunities before us every day to say no to injustice, to say yes to compassion. If you believe in second chances, if you believe God still works wonders through ordinary hands and paws, then share this story. Leave a comment, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe so these stories can keep traveling farther than any one of us could imagine. And if your heart was touched by the courage of Atlas, by the hope of children who survived, then join us in a simple prayer for them and for each other. Write Amen in the comments, and may God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and the courage to believe in miracles again.